Welcome everyone. Welcome to the first of two Pecha sessions, which are part of the 2022 MSA Salons. So for those of you who don't know, the Salons are a series of half-day sessions which occur across the 9th, 10th and 11th of March, where you can sign up for a half-day session with two of our invited guests to discuss your matters of concern in relation to design. So you'll be in mixed groups across years and courses. So it really is quite a rare opportunity in this academic calendar to engage with both external practitioners and other students from across the school that you might not normally interact with. So there's more information on that on the Manchester School of Architecture students Moodle announcements page. That announcement has been pinned at the top. And if you're already excited about this and are keen to sign up, then I will just post a link in the chat now, and you can sign up for one there. Okay, so tonight, as I say, it's one of two Pecha evenings, and we are excited to have with us 6 external practitioners who are here to share with you their ideas, passions, and matters of concern in relation to design. And they each have a maximum of 5 minutes to express this across 5 slides. Now, as I say, our guests will be salon leaders at the upcoming salon sessions in March. So this is a really good opportunity for you to consider who you may wish to sign up with to discuss your interests in relation to design. So tonight is going to be pretty fast paced, a lot of fun, and full of stimulus for some follow-up questions at the end as well. So we encourage everyone here to post your questions in the chat at any point during the presentations. And we will, as usual, hand over to our student discussant at around 6 p.m. to start running through these. So yeah, just make sure you say who your question is directed to, if it's a particular presenter you have your question for, or whether it's more of an open question that you would like to invite a response to. And without further ado now, I'm going to hand over to our first speaker of the evening, who is Kate White from Studio Kate White. Kate is an architect, interiors and spatial designer. Over to you, Kate.
Yeah, once get my port up. Here we go. Now I'll just move quickly on to my first slide and I'll begin my Pecha. My question is really, does architecture alienate? And by that I mean, is architecture communicating with building users as well as it could? And how I came to that question was from my most recent project here on the left, which is a big university building for the Olympic Park in London for UCL. And my current role, I'm projects director for Highgate Cemetery, looking at the repair and conservation of listed buildings, and also what appropriate new buildings we should be putting into this heritage attraction. The Victorians were very good at communicating through architecture. Are we doing that now? And by communicating, I mean ornamentation, because this was traditionally used as a means to communicate with building users, in and around people moving in and around buildings. So here we have the caryatids at the Temple of Athena on the Acropolis. Here we're seeing ornamentation as something very integral to a building, to its structure. These sculptures are literally holding up the porch, the portico of the temple. All 6, granted these are replicas, have been individually sculpted. They're holding up a sculpted frieze that showed the birthday festival of Athena. So to the uninitiated person, you can read that building, you can interpret what it's about. It's about memorializing a female goddess. It's an important place. The pictures are telling us the story. Traditionally, that's how buildings communicated to their audiences and their users. But what we had with the modernist movement, following, Adolf Loos's Ornament is Crime treatise, there was a conflation of ornamentation and decoration seen as being superfluous to the function of a building. So what we have is a complete stripping back of any semblance of ornamentation so that a building appears simple, functional, and pure. There's a kind of morality at play here. The modern movement conflated stripping what they saw as excess with a moral duty. And the Bauhaus in Dessau on the left tells us, we see from that building, it's functional, it's a place for working, for learning, for doing. A century and a half of this critique has become so embedded in our culture that what we have on the right is a decorated facade, a decorated box. But if we think of what contemporary ornamentation is, this is what you get. If you put that into Google, you get this Birmingham City Library by Mejias. But what it's doing is it's not telling us it's a library. It's an important civic space, what's happening inside, or how it relates to its historical context. Who did it well? Carlo Scarpa, working in the 90s and the 1940s and 1950s in Northern Italy. He started his career as an artisan and a craftsman making Murano glass. So he had that kind of one-to-one connection with a craft. He also, he did follow the principles of modernism, but his version was quite different. He stayed close to regional building traditions, and he also had to work within the restricted context of heritage sites. But he embraced the ornamental detail. He used it as something functional and decorative. And that meant that his work wasn't moralistic. There was a joy and a sensuousness to his buildings, his elevations, his details, his handrails. There's so much to see and appreciate, even for the non-architecture student or the non-architect, that any building user or passerby would appreciate this. So where are we now? If we look at on the left, we have, again, storytelling in architecture. It's what I call interpretation. How do you interpret what the building is doing, or what's the building trying to say? And here we see this wrought iron cladding on this 6A designed shopfront in Albemarle Street in London. And that's telling us about London's past, its cast iron railings, its gratings, its balconies. There was a kind of ornamental language to shopfronts in the 18th century that this is recalling, but in a contemporary way. It's a clever interpretation of that. The patterns also represent weaving. So that recalls what's happening inside the shop. It's a clothes shop. It's Paul Smith, who's a well-known designer. And then on the right, we have a group work project by Mantho, a complete rethinking of a Victorian facade for an infill site. It's a concrete building, but it's also almost like it's molding a Victorian, an existing Victorian terrace, complete with cornicing, entablature, and string courses, and perforations showing how it's used today. As a passerby, if you were a layperson, as I call it, you would look up and you would wonder what's going on in that building. It would engage you at every level of detail that it's providing. I think that's the end of mine.
Thank you, Kate. And that was bang on time as well. If you'd like to stop sharing your screen, and if I could invite Philip Etchells now to share your screen. Philip is an associate architect at OMI Architects. You're on mute, Philip.
Thanks. Sorry, that's a classic, isn't it? Should have got used to that after 2 years of all this. So the title for mine is Tabula Rasa, which, if I'm honest, is a little perhaps deliberately misleading. Normally, when we talk about use that term, it's in regards to an approach to urban design which is sweeping away and starting again. And I'm not here to advocate that kind of strategy, but more that interested me is the translation from Latin, which is clean slate or blank page. I've done a few things at universities in the past, and I've tended to use projects that I've worked on and done a linear kind of story from start to finish on a project, and I could kind of go on and do those ad infinitum, but with 5 minutes, that's probably not an option. So what I wanted to reflect on is, despite all the research we do at the beginning of a project and all the fact finding and all of those kind of exercises, the act of design itself is kind of a leap in the dark, and at some point you've got to address the blank page or the blank screen. So I'm also interested in this idea that perhaps something in design is an act of craftsmanship in and of itself. The image on screen at the moment is, I suppose, the tools of the trade of that, but also struck by some of the other similarities, such as the long period of training, the difficulty of teaching design, particularly via verbal communication. So I started to kind of get interested in this notion that perhaps there is a craft in the practice of doing architecture in some way. And considerations of architecture and craft have a very long history, and far too much for me to even touch on it here. But I kind of always go back to a book I read when I was doing my master's called The Craftsman by Sennett, which broadens the scope for what could be considered a craft way beyond perhaps what would traditionally be considered a craft activity. So for me, what I've always kind of returned to is this notion that it is a repetitive and iterative act design. It requires repeating what you're doing over and over again, and which has similarities to how one learns through craft. And it's not about drawing for the sake of drawing, but about synthesizing the parameters you're having to deal with and trying to find a solution to various problems that have been set. Again, I don't believe that's just drawing or shape making for the sake of it. It's because ultimately a huge number of iterations or possibilities have already been rejected, either consciously or unconsciously, before we even get to the page. And I don't believe that, although I kind of have focused up to this point on it being a handcraft, it has to necessarily be so. I think any medium is applicable to this, as long as it allows for the production and repetition of ideas over and over again, and a kind of a sense of improvement upon the previous version. My only observation in terms of the digital model, which is shown on screen at the moment, is the need to be able to save and keep previous versions so that one can return to them over time. I think you never know, not just during the process of designing one project, when you might need to return to a previous idea that actually turned out to be pretty good, but perhaps many years later, you may want to return to certain ideas. And so the notion of having these things saved and archived and squirreled away, it appeals to me greatly. So I guess I do kind of return to my sense that of the primacy of hand drawing in the design process. I'm really jealous of people who have wonderful sketchbooks full of lovely drawings. Mine's full of meeting notes and not a lot else, if I'm absolutely honest. So, but this is an example of probably my preferred route, which is tracing paper. And this is just an example of a project I was grappling with a year or so ago. There's probably 150, 160 sheets of sketches that represent just the earlier stages of that project. That was me just trying to work through a problem that I was struggling to resolve and a brief that I was struggling to synthesize. So I suppose the question is, what's my matter of concern? What am I saying, really? And I suppose I'm not sure I have one as such. I certainly don't intend to patronize people and tell them how to design as such. I'm sure everyone has their strategies. More, it's to share my fascination with that process about how repetitive drawing of basically the same thing and the learning by doing, how strong a tool that can be. And I'm also conscious that there's people here that are soon to go out into their career in architecture, and there can be times in anyone's career, and I think this applies to most people, where you can feel frustrated that you haven't had the chance to design as you might feel like you can. And I think the important thing is to draw through that, to find an outlet for the urge to design, because I think the skills and techniques you'll be learning in university now are worth nurturing and can be refined over time. So that's me.
Superb. Thank you, Philip. Okay, we're going to move on now to Les Postawa, who is a visiting professor here at the Manchester School of Architecture and founding principal of Les Postawa Associates. Over to you, Les.
Thank you very much. Can everyone see that? Okay. Right. Well, perfect. My concern is more positive than the negative context that you normally associate with the word, and that's how you would or expressing the structure or the structural design in particularly architectural projects. And so I'll briefly run through 5 projects which where the structure has a significant input into the architectural expression that they're trying to present. And the first of these projects is with Henning Larsen Architects from Copenhagen, but the project itself is a headquarters building for a large petrochem company in Saudi Arabia. And the idea was this vast office complex and on the Gulf Coast to house the petrochem office departments, various departments. And the whole idea was to have this tower block and associated low-rise office arranged as a floating element. And the bottom right corner image there shows how you would structure this to achieve this spanning across the and undulating form of the building itself, and how that structure using an external diagrid, exoskeletal frame, can repeat through to the brise soleil that hangs on the front of the building. And you can see in the top right image there how the structure is visualized through the brise soleil from the offices behind. Another building which many of you may be familiar with is Madrid Airport, Barracas Madrid Airport. The point of this project was the sheer scale of it. The entire length of the building, if you put all the piers and all the various terminal buildings and the satellite buildings together, the building would be over 1.7 kilometers in length from end to end. And it was a very fast track design and construction program, which required really the only form of modular construction. So it was a case of breaking down the building of such a vast scale into 72-meter long modules, and then keen, obviously, Richard Rogers, the architect I forgot to mention, they were keen to express the structure as part of the architectural form and to show and to represent the whole process of how the modular construction can come together. So it's a basic steel frame following the gold wing roof pattern, built on a 9-meter module, supported on column grids that are 18-meter modules, to create this open clear span arrangement. And just a matter of detail, really, as you can see in the bottom right corner, the eaves detail, which is this scalloped edge detail. But then when you had 2 terminal buildings adjacent to each other, as shown in the center image, they form these what were known as the canyons, which is this vast gap between the buildings, and the scalloped edge becomes a roof light in the center of a very wide building footprint. So as you can see, the steel frame under construction, and then as it's nearing completion, the top right image there shows the expression of the steel frame and how it marries together with the base concrete material, which was largely in situ concrete. So you have the transition in there in the upper ridges of the concrete columns into the steel V-shaped or tree columns down the center of each of the terminal buildings. Moving on to another project which is you may be familiar with, is Maxi Museum of 20th Century Art in Rome. Zaha Hadid was the architect for this. And here again, it's this very sprawling ribbon-like gallery building built in rather sort of an inspiring area of Rome, away from the center, but nonetheless making a statement in itself. And the whole point here of the architecture and the structure becoming an integral component with each other is how you would achieve these long spanning ribbon-like galleries. And what we did here was to use the walls, the high walls to each of the galleries as deep beams that provide the stiffness to a box-like structure, so that they can cantilever over one another or span between effectively the very few vertical points of support. So the whole building appears to float above the ground and supported just by the vertical circulation cores. The bottom left image there shows the walls under construction, how these sort of curved ribbon-like elements were able to achieve the long spans. And we're talking of spans of up to 50 meters here between supports. And the other images show the internal views and the roof lights and the ribbon louver blades that continue with this sort of linear flowing theme. Onto something which is a large, completely different scale. This is a private reading room for Lord Rothschild on his country estate in Waddesdon. Stephen Marshall Architects were the architects for this, and I mean the centre part of the whole scheme was this library or reading room, and it sits on the site of a former dairy farm on the estate. And part of the planning conditions were that the buildings had to replicate or had some sort of connection back to the former past use of the site. So this is a modern take on a traditional Victorian barn or cattle shed building. But the client wanted this sort of ornate coffered roof element, and I mean we looked at various alternatives of spanning across the in a traditional truss-like arrangement, but they didn't want to see any horizontal ties, so we developed a system whereby each plane of the pitched roof became a lattice truss to span from end to end between the two shear walls or gable walls on the end of the building. And the image at the top right there shows the computer-generated model showing the structural form. And once the client realised what we were doing in order to form the structure, he said, "Well, I don't want to hide this this structure. I want it to be like a piece of furniture." So he didn't want to see any sort of mechanical bolt fixings or metal plates or stiffeners. So we had to employ traditional woodworking or joinery detailing, as you can see in the bottom left corner there, and even to where the columns down the side, on the open side, we formed them as A-frames, so they doubled up as the longitudinal bracing elements to give the whole building rigidity on the open side.
Les, sorry to interrupt. You've got about 15 seconds left.
Okay, I'll move on then. And finally, it's not all about buildings. This is the bridge at London Bridge, just in front of the Shard. Those of you familiar with London. Again, it was adding 2 extra tracks onto the approach into London Bridge. So here we developed. I mean, the bridges that currently cross the main Borough High Street are traditional plate girders, and because we're adding another 2 tracks, they wanted to achieve something that would allow as much light in underneath the bridge. So we developed this cigar-shaped lattice truss on one side, and the image on the right there shows how this was fabricated on the viaduct over Borough Market and then slid over the High Street as one piece. But the shape was generated by the fact that there was a large S-curve on the tracks, which caused huge sideways forces. So we needed to develop a structure that would allow light through, but at the same time look appealing to the environment. And that's it.
Thank you so much, Les. Next, we have Paco Mejias, architect and lecturer in architecture from the University of Suffolk.
Okay, sorry, I has my microphone. Okay, thank you everyone here. Thank you for inviting me. So my concern is a little bit more basic. I'm really concerned about poop, and I will explain this a little bit better. Since 6 years ago, I started working in this place. This place is Karel, is one of the most biggest informal settlements in Dhaka, in the capital of Bangladesh. Not properly an slum because the place had not been subject of any kind of degradation. On the other way, the place has been improving along the years. So it's more like an informal settlement because it has been also managed and planned very bottom up. So it has a surface that is changing all the time because it's taking over this lake that you can see there, Banani Lake. What is interesting is that it's in the center of the city, surrounded by this very medium and high class fabrics of the city. Some of these flats that you see under this red roof are flats that are $2 million. So, and Karel, you can see just in front, separated by the Banani Lake. What is interesting is that it has a very high density in what is a very high dense urban environment, because Dhaka has a density over 45,000 people per square kilometer. That is quite big. But particularly Karel, with a very flat fabric, has between 250,000 to 750,000 people per square kilometer. That means, you know, between 25 to 75 people in a room, 10 by 10. And what is also interesting is that the mortality under 5 is almost 80% higher than in the formal city, and this is referring basically at the unsafe sanitation practices. So when I started to what is in Karel, the people every morning leave the informal settlement and go to the formal city because they are an important part of the human force around. So they are almost 60% of the domestic service in these more accommodated neighborhoods. 40% of the informal garment industry that you probably know is the biggest sport in Bangladesh, and 50% of the informal transportation through 50% of the men in Karel are rickshaw pullers. So we make a study, you know, a couple of years ago, trying to understand the connection of the social. So this applying the theory of the social assemblage and trying to see how the political, the social, the economic, and the supply chain is connected, and connecting the people from the informal settlement, from the people to the formal part of the city. So what is interesting is that the people have been building everything that they need. So they have been setting up a water infrastructure, trying to split the water that they have available into the whole neighborhood, with a very curated way of providing water to a few minutes, depending on the dimension of the household. They have been able to set also their own sewage collectors, as you can see in the image in the center. They even have developed with plastic and these big bags. They have been able to develop these informal boats for going to work crossing the Banani Lake. They have an important role in the waste management of the city, because they are taking a lot of plastics and glass that are in the surroundings, and they are in charge of chopping everything and selling back to the industries. They have been setting schools, markets, and playgrounds all by their own. So since the last summer, with the support of the University of Liverpool, and in collaboration with the Center of Inclusive Architecture and Urbanism, that is part of Prague University in Bangladesh, we make this macro and micro politics of sanitation. So we explore two particular alleys in Karel, and we try to understand how the people were setting the necessities of the toilets and how they manage the sharing of these toilets. We also go and draw in a forensic analysis all of these toilets, and trying to understand what are the micro politics of sharing, how they share the space, and how they have codes of colors and things, and mini location for trying to keep safe all their belongings. And finally, we are now working in these two outputs. One output is a DIY community solar septic tank. We are developing 3 prototypes in collaboration with the University of Liverpool, UCL, and WaterAid. So we're trying to build one of these prototypes for improving the sanitation conditions in Karel. And when we were making this research, we found a lot of information of off-grid toilets that we are starting to put in this manual for safe sanitation in informal settlement, where we are not only providing what are the principles that allow you to manage properly and safely human waste, also with a set of menus that allow the communities and the NGO working there to select the proper system for the place. I think that's all. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Paco. Next, we're going to move on to Robert Mantho, who is an architect, teacher and researcher at the Glasgow School of Art.
Hi, everybody. Nice to see you. I'm going to go to a much different scale than everybody else. I'm going to talk to you about a sort of very, very simple and basic idea that's also obvious and I would say even a cliche. But the notion of how anything is framed and how this framing device is a sort of conceptual framing device that is something I use when I'm thinking about pretty much any type of making, and that could be writing, painting, drawing, architecture. And I'm just going to quickly rattle through what I mean by that. I'm just saying, oh wait, there we go. So the central conceit is the notion, the classic notion of cropping reality to an incredibly small piece of it. And my contention is that no matter what you're looking at, if you crop it very, very closely and look really, really hard at it, you'll find something fascinating and potentially very beautiful. And in this case, it's the side of a trash can in Glasgow. That notion of framing, cropping, closing the world down to a set of very small and simplistic parameters has translated into a kind of exploration. And in this case, it's the cropping of an ordinary corner in an ordinary room where three walls meet. And in that cropping, you generate an idea about the way the line, or the point, the line, and the plane make space, leading to a sort of years-long exploration of color and this idea of the point, the line, and the plane as being a device for organizing color and generating form and space. And that same idea of cropping and generating something from a very simple set of parameters, in this case, an installation in an existing building in Vermont, with the notion of only using color, only using string, and only using these plastic beads to create a sort of spatial matrix that warps and forms and coalesces and collapses space as an experience for people. So the surfaces of the room were painted with a series of blocks of color, and those blocks of color mapped out a sort of spatial matrix, and then the lines of string which were weighted with the balls mapped out a corresponding but different matrix of space. And those two layers of space played off of the materiality of the string and the balls, and the way in which they, if you focused on them, they became planes that contained space. But if you focused on the color, those planes of string and the balls disappeared. And so you you got this kind of moving between the two different spatial matrices, and that was augmented by the use of the very solid planes of color. Some colors, like dark colors, when you focus on them, space falls away from your eye. Other colors, when you, like the bright pale, the light blue or the bright yellow, when you focus on them, they pull forward into your perception of space. So there was this pushing and pulling of space, all created by a set of very simple rules, simple ideas, a framework of conceptual framework that reduced the elements being used to create a quite complex spatial matrix, and that created a quite powerful haptic experience with people describing the experience as like being on drugs and having your brain's perception of space cracked open for you. And another example of a very simple set of ideas that generated an architectural composition. The parameters of this project were a place to sit, a place to stand, and a place to lie down. So reducing the architectural investigation to the framing of the three fundamental positions of the human body, and the way in which that radically altered the relationship of the human body to what is quite a spectacular landscape in Vermont, on a piece of land. The actual architecture was, or the project was motivated by providing a place for two writers to write in the woods away from their sort of domestic space. And they wanted a place that was sort of directly connected to this spectacular landscape, but that also provided them with a kind of variety of places to both either contemplate the landscape, or to engage the landscape, or to remove themselves from that landscape. And so the box to the left allows you to shape different relationships to the landscape in a sitting position. The box that hangs underneath the beam is a box that you can lie down in and either connect through the mesh to the landscape, or in some ways, in some lights, remove yourself from the landscape. And then the position at the end of the beam, where you can stand on a copper plate and contemplate and see the landscape in almost 360 degrees. So the idea that I'm trying to posit here is that for designers, the generation of a simplistic or a simple, and I would say sometimes simplistic, set of parameters that are clear and explicit can be a really great way to start, and also to contain the sort of rapid proliferation of ideas that happen in design. And for me, the notion of the establishment and the articulation of an explicit set of criteria that are, no matter how simple or how reductive, can provide a way to frame your making such that you can generate a range of quite experientially, intellectually, and I would say you can extend that to pretty much any dimension, complex making. And so that will be me finishing, I guess.
Thank you, Robert. Thank you for that.
Give you back a couple of minutes for the session there.
And lastly, we have Lucy Marshall, who is an associate landscape architect at CW Studio.
Hi, everybody. So I'm going to share with you my matter of concern, which is mainly to do with people and streets. So I I'm a landscape architect. I work for CW Studio. We're a small but perfectly formed practice in Manchester. And a few years ago, I came across this Healthy Streets indicators. And I've been using this as a way of assessing the projects that we do that involve public realm and public spaces, especially the residential ones. And are we sort of meeting all these sort of criteria? And it's a way of starting conversations, and it's also a way of just making sure that we've ticked all the boxes. So what I'm going to show you now are 3 projects that I think on 3 different scales, which are relevant to these indicators and tick a lot of these boxes, and then 1 project that I'm working on at the moment. So this is Waltham Forest in London. It's one of the sort of slightly outer boroughs of London. And they have a mini Holland project. This is all about allowing this indicator, which is people choosing to walk or cycle in their neighbourhoods. So we are building this into their daily routines. That's great for health and well-being. And this, you know, this whole idea of having an active travel neighbourhood. They are aiming to reduce car dependency, and also that then reduces air pollution, reduces traffic danger and congestion. And this is all done through cycle infrastructure and hubs, traffic calming, improvements to crossings and pavements, benches and trees and planting, and just trying to make these spaces much more attractive for people to use and say, actually, I'm going to walk there today, or actually I'm going to cycle, or I'll get the bus, because I know that I can travel through the street and I feel welcome and I feel safe and I feel that it's somewhere that I want to be. The second project, this also in London, is Gogh Walk. So this is a what was a sort of street at the end of 3 residential blocks, so quite dense terrace houses in Stockwell, and the street has been part pedestrianised. So it is a place where in one section cars are invited, but mostly it is for people. So there are existing trees have been retained, there's new tree planting, there are play elements, some are formal like the basketball hoop, some are informal like stepping stones or just balancing along benches. There are places to sit, there is a library where you can borrow books, and there's cycle parking, and it's generally a space that people can come together and use, and it might be on their journey to school, it might be on their journey to the shops, they might meet somebody there, sit and chat, might just have a moment on their own on one of the benches. It's just a really, really good way of using a space and encouraging people to sort of dwell and linger in that space. This third project, again, a slightly smaller scale. So this is a parklet by Wnb Studio. It is temporary, but can be permanent. It has this sort of single zigzag sculptural bench, takes up 2 parking spaces, has planting, has air quality monitoring, and is there as a sort of intervention to provide somewhere to rest and dwell as you're moving through this space. One of the things that really can encourage active travel and make people make choices to walk or to cycle or to get the bus easier is if there are places along your route where you can sit and rest and stop. And this is one of the places that we've been looking at, and we would like to incorporate into some of the work that we do. And so this is my sort of current concern. This is a project that CW Studio are working on with Levitt Bernstein Architects. It's in Bolton. It is an area which is currently sort of surface car parks and goes down to the River Crowle, which runs through the whole centre of Bolton. And so Gillian, the architect, and I have been using the Healthy Streets indicators to look at the spaces that we are creating, and are we sort of meeting all these different things. So we have a central square, which is overlooked and well lit, it has seating in the shade, it has seating in the sun, it has activity on the ground floor level. So there is a shop, and there will be a cafe, and there will be a cycle hub. So there are things that are always happening on that ground floor level. The balconies around the square overlook the space, and then also look into the courtyard, which provides communal garden spaces. And so we're pulling all those different elements in to try and make this a place that people feel welcome, that is inclusive, and that they want to be in. And I guess what I'm communicating and trying to sort of get across is, when we look at projects like this, we will go, well, which is the best house on this development, or which is the best apartment? Okay, there's that one. Which is the worst one? Which is the one that we don't want, you wouldn't want to live in, which would be your last choice? And how do we flip that round and make that one actually the one that you want to choose? And we apply that to streets as well. So if you have a choice of 2 streets to walk down to get home, which one are you going to choose, and why do you choose that one? Is it because there are trees? Is it because it's well lit? Is it because there's something going on the ground floor? There's activity, there's other people, and things like that. And I think that's all I want to say. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Lucy. Great. Okay, so that is all 6 speakers. So a lot of information to absorb, but nonetheless some kind of clear commonalities as well across the board. So just before we move into the student Q&A section, I'd like to ask any of our presenters if they have any questions, observations or comments for each other that you'd like to make in relation to any of the other matters of concern that you've heard of this evening from the other speakers. So this could be a commonality, a difference, perhaps even an interface between ideas, or simply an observational comment. If anyone has anything they'd like to add.
I have a question for Philip.
Hello. Yep.
Kate here, question for Philip. Hi, Philip. Thanks for your talk. I really enjoyed the emphasis on hand drawing, because I feel in architectural education it's not as appreciated as it should be. So with that in mind, what's your view on the reliance on 3D modeling in architectural education?
Crikey. I mean, I don't think I have a huge, I can only express what my personal preference is, and I suppose, and I can express my reasons for that. I think it allows a degree of freedom and an unscalability to what you're doing, so that you're not fixed by these certain quite fixed parameters. I think, but that being said, I kind of use both formats, I suppose. So it's more finding the right time for the right tool a little bit. So I think, yeah, my tendency is to err towards the hand, particularly at the earliest stages, because it allows you not to make too many decisions that don't really need to be made. Once the set of parameters or the number of things you're trying to resolve have reduced to a kind of manageable position, then perhaps that's the time to jump into the digital. And because I think there you're starting to make more firmer decisions, which is kind of what I was getting at when I was saying, if you're going to do iterations by computer modeling, you kind of really need to save those previous versions, because otherwise they're just lost, because you just build on the same thing over and over again. And that might get better and better, but it might not do. And suddenly you've lost the idea that you may have had a good idea in the first place, and it's gone forever and a bit. So I think that's probably pretty incoherent, but that's the best I can do.
That's good, thanks.
I was going to make a point about common ground, really. It was this notion of structure in architecture and its expression is very challenging, at least in my experience, because modern construction most of the time requires the structure to be hidden behind the envelope of the building for the constructional reasons, but ultimately probably primarily for thermal performance reasons. Now, I'm sure there are many good examples where that's not the case, and it can be resolved. But what struck me is that the kind of architecture I see at the moment often expresses a structure that it's an analogy. It's expressing the structure behind, but it's not really the structure itself. And And your example of the of classical architecture kind of has that same thing going on. There's certain examples where parts of the classical language are applied to represent a structure that is no longer there. And I think that's quite interesting that we've appear to be going down a similar route maybe by accident, where the real structure is hidden, but it is implied by the facade treatment itself. And you see that a lot. And so I just thought it was interesting common ground that we come across all the time when we're designing. We want to express it, but we're kind of restricted by other considerations.
Les, what would you like to come in on that? This idea of expression with regards to structure and how you consider that in your approach?
Yeah, I mean, it is interesting that there's a lot of commonality with what Kate was showing first of all, and some of the projects that I was showing in terms, particularly when it comes to putting embellishments on the outside of buildings, and if those embellishments, I mean, I personally find I have an issue where embellishments actually hide the building. They're used as a mask or a veil. And you know, I think good architecture is all about taking what are a functional element, which could be a brise-soleil or some other shading device, or thermal blanketing device, and using it to express the true architecture of the building and what's going on behind it. And so function and form and sort of go hand in hand in that regard. And you know, even when it comes to developing the structural frame or the principles of the structure and expressing them as part of the building's identity and what's going on, being honest about it, you know, all too often, you know, you have to hide away the structure, whether it's for fire protection. Well, there's ways of expressing the structure still by protecting it against fire and the like. So I think, you know, it just needs careful collaboration between all the parties involved in the design. And it's not just one person, it's not just the architect that's designing the building, there are other consultants involved as well that have a major contribution to the whole design process.
Thank you, Les. I've actually got an observation that I'd like to make as well at this time. And it's something that Robert mentioned. Robert, at the beginning of yours, you emphasized this idea of scale with regards to your matter of concern, and that yours was at a particular scale. So I suppose from what I got from your presentation is that we were talking as much about conceptual scale, the scale and scope of thinking and of ideas, as much as we were the literal scale of inquiry, the framing and the cropping. So I suppose more of a bit of an open question to all our guests here, thinking from the perspective of our students. How important is this broader understanding and consideration of scale for our students as they start to work out what it is they are passionate about, to work out how they can start to refine and formalize their interests, their concerns and ambitions in relation to design? Robert, I don't know if you want to kick off.
I mean, I quite deliberately chose that topic because I remember vividly being a student, and I remember vividly, you know, over complicating things because, you know, I was obsessed with so many different things, you know, from color to form to ambiguity to, you know, that just the list goes on. But anyway, my point was something that has become increasingly evident to me as I've practiced more in lots of different things, lots of different fields, is the idea that a reductive, you know, so in the first instance, I did use this notion of like less than a 3-inch square of the world, but the trash can that I showed as a notion about reduction, about the deliberate limiting of a set of concerns, and then the next important step, making those very explicit and saying these are the 4, these are the 3, whatever, and that limiting, that reduction can become a very powerful device for constructing a framework that allows you to operate and to suspend the questions around that operation, at least for some small period of time, such that you can operate to generate something. Because I do think there is the kind of mystery associated with design and the level of complexity, because architects are generalists who are in some way expected to have a kind of body of understanding of a vast array of things, that in the first instance, to alleviate anxiety and panic, at least as a designer, in terms of the things that you want to look at as an architect, to frame those things and make them explicit can be a really great, like, I don't know, I guess I would just call it a stress management tool. And what I was struck by is in all of the talks, there was a quite explicit laying out of the kind of, principles. And it's, not surprising that I would see my schema being utilized by all the other talkers. But it seemed to me that it was the proof of my argument that people lay out clear things, they make them explicit to everybody, and that provides a really powerful structure for their operations, whatever they be, from Les's very big things to maybe less controlled things like streets that Lucy was talking about, and all the others in between, not to leave anybody out. But anyway, I've said too much, sorry.
No, thank you, Robert. All really valid points. Would any other presenters like to come in on that, what Robert's just said?
Yeah, I mean, I guess my experience of some of the studios at Manchester is that they tackle huge issues on a political and social scale, which are, in a sense, mentally unmanageable. They cannot be resolved, or are extremely tricky, and it involves huge amounts of data and information to kind of sift through. And I think you sometimes see people struggling with that breadth. Not that it shouldn't be struggled with, because I think it should be, but I think this notion of then changing scale completely to kind of remove some of these parameters is pretty valid. And I can see that. I can't say it's a strategy I've necessarily consciously ever used, but I can see how it could be extremely productive.
Thank you, Philip. Anyone else would like to come in on that? I think we're probably at the point now where we need to move to the student Q&A section. So if it's okay with our presenters, I'd like to now hand over to our student discussant for the evening, Curlin. So Curlin, you there? That's good.
Yeah, I'm here.
So yeah, would you like to run through some questions you've got?
Yeah, sure. So the main thing about today was that there will be a lot of students who will want to meet probably every one of you. And I also wanted to narrow it down a bit more and to let them understand how you can help a bit more. So one of the things that I usually have an issue with when I'm just starting with my studio project, for example, is that I usually have a very hard time to find inspiration for what I want to design. So I was wondering if all of you could help us, all the students, a bit more and tell us, where do you usually look for inspiration before you embark on this designing process?
Not surprisingly, I have something to say about that. I think that's something that happens, as you build up your practice, you find obsessions. What I've always asked my students to do is to go back and look at all of their work and find those things that keep returning. So there's a set of things that I can rattle off that every single thing I do is about that. If I'm writing an article, it may be not, but anything in the plastic arts, it's always about the same sort of 3 or 4 things. And those are, I don't know where that inspiration comes from, those obsessions come from, but they started to show up in the earliest work that I did. So my answer to you is to look at your own work and reflect on it and see what you find there, and to make it explicit for yourself.
Yeah.
Articulate what it is that you're interested in. And it doesn't matter what it is. It will apply to pretty much anything you're doing, and you will find a way to explore those ideas with the problem or the opportunity that's being set for you. That would be my answer. Obviously, it's a simple answer that doesn't require me to tell you what to do, but there you go.
Thank you.
I would add to that, it depends on where the site is and what the brief is, of course, but really thorough analysis, site analysis, you pick up so much from the site. What is the appropriate geometry? What's the building responding to? And that's what I was trying to get at as well in my talk. Dialogue, buildings need to communicate. They need to communicate with their surroundings. And I do have a criticism of decorated boxes because they are so internalized. And if students are looking at precedents, there's a reliance on looking at precedents at the beginning of a project rather than really immersing themselves in the site, in the context, thinking of the brief. And then going back to what Robert was saying, experiential architecture. Where are you in this building? How do you move through the building? You don't know what the building looks like yet. You're visualizing it in your head. Your proportions against the building, it's the composition point again. It's getting back to, what is your journey? How do you move through that space? And then I think the outside comes from all these kind of discoveries, all these, all that research, that the outside comes from that rather than building from the outside in. And I do think that there is a prevalence, not just in education, but it's what I discussed of designing from the outside in. And then we're losing that connection. It's almost similar to our culture now of like being on screens and looking at phones and not engaging face to face. So I would always suggest that people really immerse themselves in the site. What's the materiality? What buildings will your building be talking to? What do you want people to experience in your building and around your building? And then it'll come from that. It'll all grow from that.
Can I jump in? Sorry, just because I'm really glad Kate just said what she said, because it kind of helps me a little bit, because I think she's absolutely right that the tendency to use precedent as an external image to then apply is probably not a great idea. But I'm going to sound a bit old-fashioned maybe, but a real kind of stickler for knowing your history. The history of architecture is so rich and so interesting that knowing it and being able to reference it as and when you can is an incredibly useful skill, I think. And by which I don't mean just what a building looks like, but it's, what's the plan, what's the section, what's the composition. It's that side of it as much as the image. I'd really advocate looking at precedent, but looking at it a bit beyond the image.
Yeah.
Also,
I think, I'm sorry, Lucy, I think Paco had his hand raised.
Oh, sorry.
From 2 talks ago. You're on mute, Paco.
Well, go ahead, Lucy, I don't mind.
Oh.
Go ahead.
I was just going to say that one of the sort of practical things that we do when we're looking at new projects, so the Central Street project in particular, is looking at precedents. But then if you're able to go and visit them, take your tape measure and measure out some of those spaces. So, what is the distance between the front gate and the front door, and how are the front doors arranged? We had lots of conversations about the fact that if you've got 2 front doors next to each other, you're much more likely to know your neighbour who lives in that next door house, less likely to know the mirror image with the door on the other side. So then we talked about, so you've got rear gardens and rear spaces and communal areas. So how do we make sure that there's communication and opportunities for communication in those spaces? So bringing down the fences to a certain extent. So you do have sort of private areas within your garden space. As you come closer into the centre of the courtyard spaces that we've got on that project, the fences step down, so you can chat over the fence. You know, you can get your ball back, all of those sorts of things need to work. But that going out and actually measuring and being in those spaces and understanding the scale of the building that is next to the building that you're going to be working on, and how that street works, I think is really, really important and a good place to start when you're trying to build up your own design work.
Yeah, I just wanted to give to say something about this. I think that the same idea of inspiration is quite stressful for the students, because it's something that you need to look for, but in fact we don't have an answer, a proper answer. You look at here, look at the place, like what the architect have been doing, look at the precedent, like we do, look at your own sketches, and I think, I mean, the first thing that I will say is to be relaxed about that. Probably it doesn't exist inspiration. It's something that we do more calmly, more calmly. And for me, it's always something that I found in the people. So, I mean, sometimes a precedent can be helping you to address a problem, but for instance, when we started this project in Bangladesh, what we wanted to do was a toilet, an off-grid toilet. And then we realized that the community was doing toilets much better than us, because every toilet was different. Every toilet was addressing particular micro communities happening there. Every toilet was also in the proper position. So as an external, it was impossible for us to do that. So what we realized is that they were having difficulties in the treatment of the waste. So we say, okay, probably, and it's a matter not because they don't know that is unhealthy, because they don't have the means to do that. So what we are doing as architects in there is looking for funding. So at the end, it's something that and then it's quite relaxing, because we are more like a problem solver. So we are not, in fact, very stressed about what to do. I will say to the student, the capacity of listening the people and listening their concern. I will say that is one of the most important places. And I agree that depending on the kind of work that you are doing, the inspiration could be in one place or another one. But let's try to, I mean, my opinion will be, let's try to skip the idea of inspiration. It's not very helpful.
Thank you very much. I also wanted to ask Anna to ask her a question, because I think it's quite important.
Hi, thanks, Colin. I just wrote in the chat that I wondered if a matter of concern, the subject title of your talks also actually relates to a matter of control, because that feels to me that is the theme that's running through all of the presentations, even though they're very different. And who is making those decisions and how the decision makers affect the results. So, for example, with Robert, it's about creating some simple parameters in which to design in. Lucy, thinking about the wider interaction between different people in space. Kate was referring to involving craftspeople and to what extent you include people in the design process. But I think it's just quite interesting, and it's complex, and perhaps the more people we involve in the decision making, perhaps the better the result. I don't know, just putting it out there, really.
I'd like to respond to that. I mean, what I tried to get across in my talk, whether it's successful or not, was the fact that the whole design process involves a team of people. It's not just one individual. And it's, I mean, going back to the earlier question about, what provides the inspiration, everyone involved in the project puts into that, provides or inputs into that inspirational thinking right from the very beginning.
Yeah, I guess my my little schema is in effect about trying to address a problem in a design school about how to establish even if it's only for a brief period of time, some mechanism of control. But I guess my wider experience would say that, like you suggest, the less control you try to exert, and the greater the level of collaboration, as Les suggests, in any project, both with, I think, all the people who are actively doing stuff, quote unquote, but also the other people who are inputting into that. I mean, the strangest and sometimes most wonderful things come from lots of places you never would have imagined, as Paco suggests. A lot of people who don't have maybe a formal role traditionally may bring the piece of information or the insight that unlocks everything. I mean, I've had conversations with Vermont farmers about a local school, and quite obstreperous people about spending money, whatever. But before you know it, you're having conversations that can really open up the way that everybody's thinking, the designers and the people who are going to use the project, etc. So I think that's a good piece of advice that you're suggesting there, Anna, is that maybe trying not to control things in some way, and actually being open and trying to facilitate collaboration is another really powerful way of thinking about any design process.
Can I add to that it's great we have a landscape designer here, because we have to start seeing buildings in landscape, and that landscape designers and architects are working hand in hand. It's a multidisciplinary collaboration, and that landscape doesn't come after. It's not the window dressing. It has to be symbiotic with the building, and because of our climate emergency, that has to be at the forefront of how we think about buildings and where they're sited.
Yeah, and I would just second that and make a strong plea for everybody in the room to vote, write letters to politicians, and to try to get rid of the legal distinction between the inside and the outside of streets, because that is the biggest single problem in trying to solve the urban environment, is that architect's responsibility stops at legal responsibility, and legal options stop at the external surface of the property line, and you cannot make cities that way. And I think you're right, Kate. It is about a kind of integrated consideration of the interior spaces and the exterior spaces that make a street. And then until we start thinking of those things as an integrated thing, we are going to struggle to make cities that work for human beings.
I have two projects at the moment, which are quite similar. One, we have been involved with the architects from the beginning, and it is very much a collaborative process. We have joint workshops, we look at materials together, we talk about the inside spaces, we talk about the outside spaces. We're interested in what they're doing. They're really interested in our processes and how we work, and it's fantastic. It's going to be a really brilliant project, and with a very supportive client, then you're flying and you're doing the best work that you can do. We have another project where we are very much being brought in as an afterthought, and it's now a bit of a battle, because we are asking for information, we are pointing out potential problems and constraints with the site, with legislation, with planning regulations that haven't been considered because we haven't been involved. And so, I'm very much of the let's all start together at the beginning, at the same page, in the middle of the site, looking at it and talking as a team, because I think that's really important. And if you can start that when you're on your courses and studying and starting to build up those relationships and understanding the different roles within the urban environment, then that's brilliant, because it will help you massively when you move on into practice.
I think that is a perfect point and a perfect sentiment, Lucy, for us to call time on this first Pecha Culture session. So, yeah, it's gone very quick. So firstly, I'd like to thank you all for joining us this evening, all 6 of our guests, for your interesting, unique and diverse talks. So I hope everyone can join me in unmuting and giving our guests a bit of a virtual round of applause, if that's okay.